What are the actual factors that make a whiskey cask go up in value? For me, this is probably the most important thing that anybody needs to know and understand. And my God, is it a complicated minefield with so many variables. But if I take you through some of the most easily accessible ones for you to verify, obviously age. Everyone talks about age. As whiskey gets older, it always gets more expensive. Now, that could be a broad brushstroke approach to any whiskey cask, any whiskey investment. But as with anything in life, as in a Fiat or a Ferrari, things will be more expensive based upon varying factors. Now, the thing that will drive your whiskey cask growth is, number one, is it owned by $1 billion stock market listed company? Wonderful. Number two, can you actually get hold of that cask with full naming rights? This is probably one of the most important things, because if you're going to sell your cask, you're going to be selling it to an independent bottler or back to the distillery, and people that buy that, they want to know that they can put the name of the distillery on it, otherwise it's worthless to them. As a cask gets older, the liquid inside it becomes, this beautiful, wonderful Scottish thing that people around the world continue to drink, taste and enjoy. So here's a real example. A few years ago, we were buying casks of Royal Brackla, anywhere from 4 years of age up to 12 years of age. Royal Brackla is owned by one of these big billion-dollar companies, your Bacardis, your Pernod Ricards, your Diageos. And nobody had a clue, what was going to happen with Royal Brackla. But lo and behold, in the background, the big parent company had been planning a rebrand. And a rebrand was launched, and whole new labels, the whole new age releases and age statements came out, and all new cask finishes and cask types. And of course, the value of these bottles greatly increased. Now, once that happened, then of course the value of these casks that people had been lucky enough to buy at the right time through our own knowledge that we were passing on, they then made great gains on these casks too. Now, of course, if you're doing your research, you might be able to spot a whiskey brand that may have an older fashioned label on it. And if you do, then the chances are probably good that across the next 10 years, a company like a Diageo or a Bacardi or a Pernod Ricard or one of the multitude of bigger companies is going to be spending their money investing into a rebrand. And that is a real key point that I always look for when we're looking around trying to buy casks, because there are always hugely accessible casks everywhere, but it's about finding those gems that then you can pass on to the end consumer. Other variable factors are, of course, rarity. Age and rarity sort of tend to go together. If you are lucky enough to be able to afford to buy a cask that is 15, 20 years of age, then if you can sit on it for 5, 10, 15 years, by the time it gets to 25, 30 years of age, there are going to be so few of them about that the value of that have greatly increased and will be outperforming the market. You always tend to find that the older casks, because they are rare, because a lot of whiskey is bottled between the age range of 10 to 20 years of age, then the rarity of those 30-year-old casks or 25-year-old casks greatly shoots up, and then there's a scramble. That scramble is created by the growth of independent bottlers worldwide. It's also created by the distilleries themselves. These distilleries are expanding the global reach of whiskey, and therefore, on occasions, they would quite like to buy these casks back, and they would quite like to bottle that because they have, across the last 10 years, expanded the global reach of their company. And that is one of, if not again, a key factor to be taken into account when making your choice of cask to determine. Now, this doesn't always hold true, because sometimes you can be very lucky and you can get your hands on a super rare cask, something like a Coila, for example, or a Bunnahabhain, or a multitude of other brands that is very rare, but somehow we've came across it as new make, or as a 3-year-old, or as a 5-year-old. When something is rare, it's just rare. And if you can get your hands on it at any age, it's always worth the investment. One of the greatest examples I can ever give is I stood in Springbank Distillery back in 2012, 2011. And when I was standing in Springbank Distillery, I was looking at some of these really old, wonderful bottles that they had. And there was 2 bottles from the 1930s sitting on the shelf at £15,000 a bottle. And I was umming and ahhing, should I, shouldn't I? Oh, I've been so desperate to want to try this bottle. And I very reluctantly held off. In walked an American, took one look at it, most expensive bottle bottle in the shop, took it off the shelf. A minute later, a person behind the till walked out, took the price tag off the shelf, and then cost that last remaining bottle at £40,000. I was kicking myself, my wife, my friends, they were just laughing at me. So, you know, that goes to prove some of those points. One of the biggest problems right now within the whiskey investment market is people losing money or their investment stagnating. And that's a bad side to the market. You know, there are all these great key things that I've said already that you can look out for, you can research yourself. But the bad side of it is all of these other whiskey investment companies that have popped up that don't have a track record of 5, 10 years or longer being established. Now, what a lot of these companies are doing is they are bulk buying whiskey from distilleries you've never heard of, or distilleries that don't have prevalence themselves. But these are distilleries that do not carry the prestige that give your cask the ability to earn you money. If somebody is trying to sell you a cask that is from a distillery that you've never really heard of, or that distillery is only 5 or 10 years old, that is the biggest red flag you can look for, because what that means is that company has been offered that cask really, really cheaply by the distillery so that the distillery can keep funding itself to keep going. That is unless somehow somebody was to get hold of a Port Ellen cask from the recently opened Port Ellen by Diageo. But that's not going to happen. Be very, very, very careful of anyone that is offering you new make spirit or a cask that is 2, 3, 4 years old from a distillery that itself 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 years old, because that distillery might not exist. That distillery will be pumping out hundreds, thousands of casks into the market that will prevent your cask being one of the rare ones further down the road. Hopefully that gives you some key things to look out for yourselves on what actually drives up the price of a whiskey cask. If you've got any further questions, just drop them below.